Part 3, An End to the Narrative of Liberation. Both Getachew and Wilder find inspiration in the work of David Scott, drawing on his adaptation and employment of the notions of the problem space and of futures past, respectively. Scott is one of the most eloquent advocates of a post-colonial line of argument, according to which the narrative of liberation that was articulated by anti-colonial thinkers and activists can no longer command our allegiance. Indeed, in his 1999 book, Refashioning Futures, Criticism After Postcoloniality, Scott argues that the problem space in which the anti-colonial project made sense and operated has been rendered irredeemably obsolete. That problem space, Scott contends, had of course been defined by the demand for political decolonization, the demand for the overthrow of colonial power. Its principal goal, the achievement of political sovereignty. But formal sovereignty did not mean emancipation. To the contrary, according to Scott, the colonial managed to persist in the heart of sovereignty, a state of affairs which was originally theorized as neocolonialism and cultural imperialism, and which later enabled post-coloniality to problematize colonialism as a discursive formation enduring into the present. Even more fundamentally, Scott argues, with the collapse of the Bandung and socialist projects and with the hegemony of a neoliberal globalization, it became no longer clear how to even think of an alternative to Western power, much less defend such an alternative. In a word, as Scott would have it, the epistemological assumptions that had held the anti-colonial project together and guaranteed the salience of its emancipatory hopes, assumptions about history, about culture, politics, resistance, freedom, subjectivity, have been steadily eroded by the labor of anti-metaphysical and anti-teleological strategies of criticism. Scott holds up Frantz Fanon's 1961 classic, The Wretched of the Earth, published just before Fanon's untimely death, as one of the great texts through which the anti-colonial narrative of liberation was articulated. Indeed, Scott contends, more than any work on the cultural politics of decolonization, on what Ngugi would summarize in his memorable phrase, decolonizing the mind, this book captures the spirit of militant insurgency that characterized the refusal of colonial subordination and tutelage and the unequivocal demand for absolute political sovereignty that marked the Bandung years. Yet Scott insists, standing where we are, we no longer look into the same future that Fanon did. We do not because we cannot. And we cannot, he argues, because the shift that has taken place around us has altered the very enabling, disabling conditions of possibility of political criticism itself. We stand, in Scott's judgment, in an historical predicament in which the old languages of left politics, that is to say, the oppositional languages of emancipation, are no longer effective. Or put otherwise, standing where we do after colonialism, we do not share politico-epistemic space with Fanon. To drive the point home more bluntly, Scott adds, quite caustically, it is, I believe, a romance, the self-indulgent nostalgia of late modernity, to read Fanon as though we were about to join him in the trenches of the anti-colonial national liberation struggle. What does Scott mean by the narrative of liberation, of which he interprets The Wretched of the Earth to be perhaps the most profound instance or elaboration? In Scott's words, by a narrative of liberation, I mean a more or less structured story that progressively links through such generative tropes as repression, alienation, consciousness, awakening, resistance, struggle, and realization, a past and a present of domination to an anticipated future of freedom. A narrative of a liberation on this view works through the construction of a certain economy of discourse, the central elements of which are not hard to identify. It operates by constructing, for instance, a teleological rhythm in which the various moments and maneuvers that constitute the struggle are identified in their succession, by constructing a repressive power that denies the subjugated their essential humanity and whose absolute overcoming constitutes the singular objective and destiny of the struggle, by constructing a subject who moves from alienated dehumanization to self-realization, and by constructing a beyond in which there emerges a new and unencumbered humanity. Scott walks us through step by step how he sees this narrative to play itself out in Fanon's canonical text, which traces the nature and the path of decolonization. Fanon's story begins with a depiction of the colonized as physically and psychologically dehumanized. The response to the situation is at first inchoate, taking the form of more or less disorganized violence and forms of ritual possession and magic. A good deal of this violence is initially horizontal, directed inward at the colonized themselves. Even so, these outbursts are important for at least two reasons. First, because they allow the colonized a concrete outlet for their pent-up rage, and second, because they signal to the colonizer that there is too much disorder to continue ruling in the old way. This in turn leads to the undertaking of a familiar dialogue concerning values between certain colonized intellectuals and the colonizer. As Scott summarizes, the natives are, however, not persuaded by this discourse about morality. Eventually, the native learns that the settler is not the superhuman he makes himself out to be. His glance ceases to turn the native to stone. As the disorder grows, moreover, a section of the intelligentsia goes over to the side of the people. The aggressivity and violence of the natives are rechanneled away from themselves and given a political and specifically anti-colonial focus. This is a turning point. It is for the colonized the moment of consciousness, the moment of awakening, the creation of what one might call an anti-colonial will. The criminal is turned into an activist. The lumpen becomes a militant. Moreover, through this canalization of the violence of the colonized, there also begins a period of psychic healing, the reconstitution of the alienated self of the colonized. The new man of whom Fanon speaks begins to emerge. Scott urges not an outright dismissal, but nevertheless a fundamental repositioning of Fanon's criticisms and hopes, one that rids them of the alienation model of the narrative of liberation in which they are originally formulated, a repositioning that at the same time allows us to guard against the allegedly unreflexive idea of an essential native subject embedded in the Fanonian story. On the one hand, Scott insists that several decades into the project of constructing the political forms of our national sovereignty, sovereignty for which people like Fanon paid dearly, our questions cannot continue to be those of realizing that threshold. Indeed, according to Scott, a Fanonian politics of national liberation is only intelligible when the currency of nation-state sovereignty has value as an unattained aspiration that counts in global politics. But today, he continues, not only do we inhabit the normative terrain of that threshold, in the sense that an anti-colonial argument does not have much work to do to produce effectively its legitimacy, but simultaneously the currency value of that national sovereignty has vastly declined. Therefore, he concludes, to gain any sort of critical purchase, our oppositional questions, the revised questions about our futures, have rather to be those of unsettling the settled settlements of this very post-colonial sovereignty itself. On the other hand, Scott also contends that there is an assumption in the Fanonian story that the colonized are alienated from a harmonious identity, that this alienation is fostered by colonial institutions that repress the colonized self and prevent the colonized people from achieving a higher and unifying consensus. Indeed, Scott argues, for Fanon, the redemptive project of overcoming colonialism is to return the natives to themselves. But, Scott goes on to ask, who exactly are these natives? What is their gender? What is their ethnicity? What is their class? What is their sexual orientation? What are their modes of self-fashioning? After posing such questions, Scott proceeds to stress his worry that the Fanonian story underwrites too much or gives too much space to the normalized centrality of a specific identity, even though an identity argued to have suffered particular injuries under colonial domination. There's a lot to digest in Scott's sophisticated critique of the narrative of liberation. But the upshot of it all is that for him, the dream of human emancipation is over, or perhaps not quite. Scott ends up employing Foucault as a strategic supplement, if not corrective to, or dialectical displacement of, Fanon. Scott argues that we should stay faithful to Fanon in certain respects, namely to Fanon's unequivocal refusal of the European game of colonial and neocolonial dependence and mimicry, as well as to his responsiveness to the subaltern demand for a future constructed in its own vernacular image, and even to his insistence that the last shall be first. Nonetheless, he emphasizes that such a Fanonian register of affirmation should be supplemented by a Foucauldian reminder about the exclusions inevitably entailed in the pursuit of affirmative political demands. In other words, he urges a Foucauldian caution against the tendency towards normalization and a Foucauldian sensitivity to the otherness at the heart of order and the difference that identity invariably denies. With that, we'll take another break.